Hello, America. My name is Dylan John, and you are listening to the Neofusionist Book Review. This is not your typical book review, as I make no claims to political or philosophical impartiality. This podcast uses the format of a book review to explore the premise of neofusionism. Neofusionism is the merging of paleoconservatism with naturalism within the framework of the revitalization of the Republican Party. We will be exploring politics, philosophy, psychology, economics, and sociology through a wide variety of books, published both recently and historically. Thank you for tuning in. So for today's show, we are going to be looking at The Fourth Political Theory by Alexander Dugin. Alexander Dugin is a Russian philosopher, and he is a geopolitical strategist. He is a professor at Moscow State University and an advisor to the Kremlin. And he's put forward the fourth political theory, which incorporates some of his geopolitical ideas and some of his philosophical ideas. And this ultimately is a response to global liberalism. It's an anti-liberal perspective. It blends closely with the previous book, Why Liberalism Failed, by Patrick Deneen, because that sort of leaves open the possibility of a post-liberal society and explores what that would look like. And I think that kind of flows right into this book here, although we'll look at some of the differences between them as well. So the last book, when it ended, it was talking about, it talked about liberalism, but it also talked about communism and fascism as three political ideologies. This book follows that same kind of formula, and that's why it's called the fourth political theory. It looks at liberalism, communism, fascism as three political theories that have failed. Liberalism has lasted the longest, but it is in the process of failing. And so this is kind of a response to the failure of liberalism. And so I'm going to read a number of sections here that kind of give a breakdown. He's really an interesting author because he's a student of Heidegger. Not physically a student, like he didn't work with him, but he studies Heidegger. He's influenced by Heidegger. And some occult ideas. And so there's all kinds of interesting tangents that this book goes down. Clearly, there's a lot of stuff that I'm not going to be able to get to because, like usual, I want to focus on a few specific points that kind of help develop the argument that I'm making. We'll start here toward the beginning with a basic definition of what the fourth political theory is. He says, quote, "Liberalism has been an ideology from the start. It was not as dogmatic as Marxism, but was no less philosophical, graceful, and refined. It ideologically opposed Marxism and fascism, not only undertaking a technological war for survival, but also defending its right to monopolize its own image of the future. While the other competing ideologies were in existence, liberalism continued and grew stronger precisely as an ideology. In other words, as a set of ideas, viewpoints, and projects that are typical for a historical subject. Each of the three political theories had its own subject. The subject of communism was class. Fascism's subject was the state, in Italian fascism under Mussolini, or race in Hitler's National Socialism. In liberalism, the subject was represented by the individual, freed from all forms of collective identity and any membership. While the ideological struggle had formal opponents, entire nations and societies, at least theoretically, were able to select their subject of choice, that of class, racism, or statism, or individualism. The victory of liberalism resolved this question. The individual became the normative subject within the framework of all mankind. This is when the phenomenon of globalization entered the stage. The model of a post-industrial society makes itself known, and the postmodern era begins. From now on, the individual subject is no longer the result of choice, but is a kind of mandatory given. Man is freed from his membership in a community and from any collective identity, and the ideology of human rights becomes widely accepted, at least in theory, and is practically compulsory. Humanity, under liberalism, comprised entirely of individuals, is naturally drawn toward universality and seeks to become global and unified. Thus, the projects of world government, or globalism, are born. A new level of technological development makes it possible to achieve independence from the class structuralization of industrial societies, in other words, post-industrialism. The values of rationalism, scientism, and positivism are recognized as veiled forms of repressive totalitarian policies, or the grand narrative, and are criticized. At the same time, this is accompanied by the glorification of total freedom and the independence of the individual from any kind of limits, including reason, morality, identity, social, ethnic, or even gender, discipline, and so on. This is the condition of post-modernity. At this stage, liberalism ceases to be the first political theory and becomes the only post-political practice. Fukuyama's end of history arrives. Economics, in the form of the global capitalist market, replaces politics, and states and nations are dissolved in the melting pot of world globalization. Having triumphed, liberalism disappears and turns into a different entity, into post-liberalism. It no longer has political dimensions, nor does it represent free choice, but instead becomes a kind of historically deterministic destiny. This is the source of the thesis about post-industrial society, economics as destiny. Thus, the beginning of the 21st century coincides with the end of ideology, that is, all three of them. Each met a different end. The third political theory was destroyed in its youth, the second died of decrepit old age, and the first was reborn as something else, as post-liberalism and the global market society. In any case, the form which all three political theories took in the 20th century is no longer useful, effective, or relevant. They lack the ability to explain contemporary reality or to help us understand current events, and are incapable of responding to the new global challenges. The need for the fourth political theory stems from this assessment. End quote. So, in this section, we can see that he very closely associates liberalism with globalism, and liberalism's focus on the individual and the desire of a sea of autonomous individuals to want to form a collective of the grandest scale, a universal state. And so, with those things being so closely tied together, and his skepticism about liberalism and the functionality of this hyper individualism, and as he says, the independence of the individual from any kind of limits, including reason, morality, identity, social, ethnic, or even gender, discipline, and so on. That's what he says this is the condition of post-modernity. So this complete and utter liberation from any defining characteristic is under the management of a global state is the endpoint of individualistic liberalism. And this is what he's opposed to. And so, yeah, all the subject of the others was the class from communism, and then the state, he says, for Italian fascism, and race in Hitler's National Socialism or Nazism. Those are the different subjects of these different political theories. And, so he doesn't think that any of those have made effective subjects. And so part of this book is a question of what is going to be the next subject. So then he says, well, he basically says we have these different historical subjects, and in a post-liberal or a post-ideological world, what becomes the new subject? In the fourth political theory, what becomes the new subject? And he says that, he says, quote, "We cleared a space and correctly posed the question. We specified the problem of clarifying the historical subject in the fourth political theory. Now there is a gaping void, which is extremely interesting and significant. Heading into the depths of this void, we propose 4 hypotheses, which are not mutually exclusive, and which can be examined both collectively and individually. The first hypothesis suggests abandoning all types of contenders for the role of historical subject from classical political theory, assuming that the subject of the fourth political theory is some type of compound, not the individual, class, state, race, or nation on their own, but instead a certain combination thereof. This is the hypothesis of a compound subject." End quote. Okay, so he says there are 4 hypotheses. That was the first hypothesis, and that's all he says about the first hypothesis. It's just assuming that, he says, abandoning all contenders for the role of historical subject, and assuming that it is going to be a certain combination of the individual, the class, the state, the race, the nation, the different, the family unit, the wide array of different potential historical subjects. He goes into more detail in the other second through fourth hypotheses. I'm not going to go into those. I suggest you pick up the book and look through it yourself. It has to do with, some of it has to do with Heidegger. You can analyze the validity of those. My particular preference here is the first one, the one he gives the least amount of attention to, because even the concept of a historical subject is fundamentally ideological to me. So when you look at what Patrick Deneen was saying about the end of ideology and about the top-down approach and eliminating the top-down ideological approach and generating a bottom-up organic approach to political theory, to say that there is this, that, or the other subject of history, and then construct a society that conforms to your notion of what the subject of history is, that is a fundamentally ideological act. So the first hypothesis suggests abandoning all contenders for the role of a historical subject. The whole universe is the subject of history. And that includes all these different components, and they become the components that are important to us. The subject of our narratives is ourselves, and the organizations that we're a part of, and our extended self, and our extended worlds. The world is the subject of the world in its own way. And so that's kind of going to create more of a eclectic, pluralistic sort of perspective with different people pursuing different objectives that I think fits well with the whole pluralistic, diverse vision of progress that I've been talking about ever since Edmund Burke, and was, focused on a little bit in The Virtue of Nationalism by Yoram Hazony. The whole idea of having a diversity of different entities acting in a competitive marketplace, if you will, achieving different rates of success and failure and different rates of longevity, and different capacity for information distribution or whatever. This sort of idea of not having a single historical subject, but having a bunch of different entities that compete for human attention seems more appropriate. So there's that section there. He spends some time talking about monotonic processes. This was chapter 3. This section I thought was really interesting, and there are a number of portions here that I want to read to you. I'm going to develop this idea a little bit more, I believe, in a couple of other future books, because I found he talks about a couple books in here. One of them I'm going to get and review because I think it sounds interesting. So when he talks about monotonic processes, he says the following: the idea of modernization is based on the idea of progress. When we use the term modernization, we certainly mean progress, linear accumulation, and a certain continuous process. When we speak of modernization, we presuppose development, growth, and evolution. This is the same semantic system. Thus, when we speak of the unconditionally positive achievements of modernization, we agree with a very important basic paradigm. We agree with the idea that human society is developing, progressing, evolving, growing, and getting better and better. That is to say, we share a particular vision of historical optimism. This historical optimism pertains to the 3 classical political ideologies: liberalism, communism, and fascism. It is rooted in the scientific, societal, political, and social worldview, in the humanities and natural sciences of the 18th and 19th centuries, when the idea of progress, development, and growth was taken as an axiom that could not be doubted. In other words, this entire set of axioms, as well as the whole historiography and predictive analytics of the 19th century in the humanities and the natural sciences, was built on the idea of progress. We can easily trace the development of this subject, the idea of progress, in the 3 political ideologies. Let us turn to the classical liberalism of the sociologist Herbert Spencer. He claimed that the development of human society is the next stage of the evolution of the animal species, and that there is a connection and a continuity between the animal world and social development. And therefore, all the laws of the animal world leading to development, improvement, and evolution in the animal world within Darwin's framework can be projected onto society. This is the basis of the famous theory social Darwinism, of which Spencer was a classic representative. If, according to Darwin, the driving force behind the evolution of the animal kingdom is the struggle for survival and natural selection, then the same process must take place in society, argued Spencer. And the more perfect this struggle is for survival, interspecies, intraspecies, the struggle of the strong against the weak, the competition for resources, pleasure, the more perfect our society becomes. The question is how to aid this process of selection. According to Spencer, this is the central theme of the liberal model and is the meaning of social progress. Therefore, if we are liberals in one way or the other, we inherited this zoological approach to social development based on the struggle against and the destruction of the weak by the strong. However, Spencer's theory contains one important point. He argued that there are 2 phases of social development. The first phase occurs when the struggle for survival is conducted crudely by force. This is characteristic of the ancient world. The second occurs when the struggle is carried out more subtly through economic means. Once the bourgeois revolution takes place, the struggle for survival does not stop. According to Spencer, it acquires new, more advanced, and more efficient forms. It relocates into the sphere of the market. Here, the strongest survive, that is, the richest. Instead of the most powerful feudal lord, a hero, a strong person, or a leader, who simply seizes all that is up for grabs around his community, taking away all that belongs to other nations and races and sharing it with the ruling ethnicity or caste, now comes the capitalist, who brings the same aggressive animal principle to the market, the corporation, and the trading company. This transition from the order of power to the order of money, according to Spencer, does not mean the humanization of the process, but only underscores greater effectiveness. that is to say, the struggle in the market sphere between the strong, meaning rich, and the weak, meaning poor, becomes more efficient and leads to higher levels of development until super-rich, super-strong, and super-developed countries appear. Progress, according to Spencer, and more broadly speaking, according to liberalism, is always the growth of economic power. Since this continues to refine the struggle for survival of the animal species, the warfare methods of strong nations, and the castes within the framework of pre-capitalist states. Thus, an animalistic form of aggression is embedded in the liberal idea of progress, which is regarded as the main trajectory of social development. With more economic freedom, there is greater power for takeovers, attacks, mergers, and acquisitions. Liberal discourse, meaning the analysis of the liberal ideologist, is a completely animal discourse. In such a system, the more advanced law or the more advanced, more modern methods of production do not mean that they are more humane. What it means is that they allow more opportunities for the strong to more effectively realize their power, while the weak can only admit defeat, or if they have any strength left, fight on. In this manner, the modern idea of economic growth, as we see in liberals such as Alan Greenspan and Ben Bernanke, has its foundation and origins in the idea of the struggle between species, that is, the feral destruction of the weak by the strong, only instead of the conflict between predators and herbivores, we have the golden billion, and in that golden billion, their own kings of beasts, the New York Stock Exchange and the World Bank bankers, who devour all that is up for grabs, and at the same time turn the forests of the world into social infrastructures. Therefore, when we speak of modernization in the liberal vein, of necessity we mean the enhancement of the social, political, cultural, spiritual, and informational scenario within which the absolute aggression of the strong against the weak can be implemented. End quote. So, he basically says here that liberalism is a fundamentally animalistic evolutionary process. He does not approve. I think he discounts human compassion a little bit in here. And I think that in reality, this sort of evolutionary process is permanently a part of all life on Earth, and one way or another, it's going to happen, and we're going to have it. I think that to try to deny that is kind of foolish. But at any rate, he continues on in this vein, and he says, quote, "In one way or another, all three ideologies originate from the same trend, the idea of growth, development, progress, evolution, and of the constant cumulative improvement of society. They all view the world and the entire historical process as linear growth. They differ in their interpretation of this process, and they attribute different meanings to it, but they all accept the irreversibility of history and its progressive character. Thus, modernization is a concept that sends us back directly to the three classical political ideologies. Furthermore, we can see the common ground that unites the three ideologies through the idea of progress and in their positive evaluation of the concept of modernization. Nowadays, all three of these ideologies are being gradually discarded. This is strongly evident in regard to fascism and communism, but is somewhat less obvious with regard to liberalism. But even liberalism is gradually ceasing to satisfy the majority of the world's population and simultaneously is turning into something other than what it was during the classical era of modernity. Consequently, it is about time that we pose the question of searching for the fourth political theory beyond the first three. Additionally, the radical rejection of the three classical theories reflects our attitude toward what is common to them all, that is, our attitude toward modernization, progress, evolution, development, and growth. The American scientist Gregory Bateson, a theory of ethno-sociology, cybernetics, and ecology, as well as a psychoanalyst and a linguist, describes the monotonic process in his book Mind and Nature. The monotonic process is the idea of constant growth, constant accumulation, development, steady progress, all accompanied by the increase of only one specific indicator. In mathematics, this is associated with the ideas of the monotonic value. In other words, the ever-increasing value. Hence, monotonic functions. Monotonic processes are the type that always proceed in only one direction. For example, all their indicators consistently increase without cyclical fluctuations and oscillations. Studying the monotonic process at three levels: at the level of biology, or life, at the level of mechanics, steam engines, internal combustion engines, and at the level of social phenomena, Bateson concluded that when this process occurs in nature, it immediately destroys the species. If we are talking about an artificial device, it breaks down. If we mean a society, the society deteriorates and disappears. The monotonic process in biology is incompatible with life. It is an anti-biological phenomenon. Monotonic processes are completely absent from nature. All the processes which accumulate only one particular thing, or emphasize only one particular trait, result in death. Monotonic processes do not exist in any biological species, from cells to the most complex organisms. As soon as this kind of a monotonic process begins, deviants, giants, dwarfs, and other freaks of nature appear. They are disabled, incompatible with life, cannot produce offspring, and life itself casts them out. Solving the problem of monotonic processes was one of the most important problems in the development of steam engines. It turns out that the most important design element in steam engines is the centrifugal governor. When a steam engine reaches cruising speed, it is necessary to regulate the intake of fuel, otherwise the monotonic process initiates, everything begins to resonate, and the speed of the engine can increase indefinitely, causing it to explode. It was precisely this solution of avoiding the monotonic process in mechanics that was the principal theoretical, mathematical, physical, and engineering problem during the early stage of industrialization. It turns out that the monotonic process is not only incompatible with life, but also with the proper functioning of a mechanical device. The task of designing a device must avoid the monotonic process, that is, must prevent one-dimensional progress, evolution, development, and the placement of growth into a closed cycle. By analyzing sociology, Bateson showed that there are no monotonic processes in real societies. Monotonic processes, such as population growth, in most cases led to wars, which then reduced the population. In our society today, we see an unprecedented level of technological progress, along with unbelievable moral degradation. If we look at all this evidence without the evolutionary bias, then we will realize that monotonic processes exist only in people's minds. In other words, they are purely ideological models. Bateson demonstrated that they do not exist in biological, mechanical, or social reality. Marcel Mauss, a well-known French sociologist, criticized the monotonic process as well. In the book he co-authored, Sacrifice, Its Nature and Functions, and especially in his essay, The Gift, he showed that traditional societies paid great attention to the ritual destruction or sacrifice of surplus goods. The surplus was seen as excessive, licho, and usurious. Licho personifies evil. Usury is the interest charged on borrowed capital, and excess is that which is obtained beyond one's needs. For instance, surplus crops were seen as disastrous in traditional society. The ancient worldview was based on the belief that an increase in one area translates into a decrease in another. Therefore, a surplus had to be destroyed as soon as possible. For this purpose, the community either organized a feast, consuming all the additional food until they choked, or else gave it to the gods in the form of a sacrifice, gave it out to the needy, or destroyed it. This is the origin of a special ritual, the potlatch, which brings about the deliberate gifting or destruction of excess personal property. Marcel Mauss proved that the belief in the destructiveness of monotonic processes lies at the foundations of human sociality. The society remains strong only through the rejection of the monotonic process and by turning growth into a cycle. Alright, so there we really get the introduction to the monotonic process of a process that simply increases without any disruption. without any fluctuation or being a part of a pattern, that it can't be introduced into a closed system because it'll break the system. I'm not a scientist, but I find this idea really interesting. And so the book that he mentions in there, this Bateson fellow, who talks about the monotonic processes, I've actually got that book on the way being delivered to my house so that I can review it. It sounds pretty interesting, and it sounds like an area that I would like to explore a little bit further, so I got it. And within the next couple of books, probably not next, but coming up soon, that book will be reviewed and into the mix. So from there he goes on and he says, in terms of its methodological base, the fourth political theory must be rooted in the fundamental rejection of the monotonic process. That is to say, the fourth political theory must assert that the monotonic process is unscientific, inadequate, amoral, and untrue as its future axiom, without specifying how the monotonic process must be rejected. And everything that appeals to the monotonic process and its variations, such as development, evolution, and modernization, should at the very least be understood in terms of the cyclical model. Instead of the ideas of the monotonic process, progress, and modernization, we must endorse other slogans directed toward life, repetition, the preservation of that which is of value, and changing of that which should be changed. Instead of always looking for modernization and growth, we should instead orient ourselves in the direction of balance, adaptability, and harmony. Instead of desiring to move upward and forward, we must adapt to that which exists, to understand where we are, and to harmonize socio-political processes. And most important, instead of growth, progress, and development, there is life. After all, there has been no proof offered yet to show that life is linked to growth. This was the myth of the 19th century. Life, in contrast, is connected to the eternal return. In the end, even Nietzsche incorporated his idea of the will to power into the concept of eternal return. The very logic of life, to which Nietzsche was dedicated, told him that if there is growth in life, the Apollonian movement toward the Logos, then the balance of the nocturnal Dionysian world exists as well, and Apollo is not just opposed to Dionysus, they complement each other. Half of the cycle constitutes modernization, while the other half decline. When one half faces up, the other half faces down. There is no life without death. Being towards death, careful to death, to the flip side of the sphere of being, as Heidegger wrote, is not a struggle with life, but rather its glorification and its foundation. We must put an end to antiquated political ideologies and theories. If we have truly rejected Marxism and fascism, then what remains is to reject liberalism. Liberalism is an equally outdated, cruel, misanthropic ideology like the two previous ones. The term liberalism should be equated with the terms fascism and communism. Liberalism is responsible for no fewer historic crimes than fascism, Auschwitz, and communism, the Gulag. It is responsible for slavery, the destruction of the Native Americans in the United States, for Hiroshima and Nagasaki, for the aggression in Serbia, Iraq, and Afghanistan, for the devastation and the economic exploitation of millions of people on the planet, and for the ignoble and cynical lies which whitewash this history. But most important, we must reject the base upon which these three ideologies stand, the monotonic process in all its forms, that is, evolution, growth, modernization, progress, development, and all that which seemed scientific in the 19th century but was exposed as unscientific in the 20th century. We must also abandon the philosophy of development and propose the following slogan: life is more important than growth. Instead of the ideology of development, we must place our bets on the ideology of conservatism and conservation. However, we not only require conservatism in our daily lives, but also philosophical conservatism. We need the philosophy of conservatism." End quote. Okay, so he's talking about the rejection of the monotonic process by the fourth political theory, and he is comparing growth with life, which may sound kind of strange at first. But I guess I think that if, like an economy or something, for an economy to just grow indefinitely, seems like unrealistic. That it seems more like an economy should reach a state of equilibrium, because the resources upon which growth is built are limited. And with limited resources and with limited capacities, we can't have unlimited growth. That doesn't make any sense. Can't possibly be unlimited when we live in a world of constraints and limitations. So, life is a state of equilibrium where we continue on. Not forever. We're not aiming for forever. But for the foreseeable future, we will continue on in a state of equilibrium and survive and live. The perpetual growth model is a track toward destruction. It's not a track toward like a long-term sustainability that comes from a state of equilibrium. So as you can tell, there are kind of ecological underpinnings to what he's talking about here. And he toward the end he talks about conservatism and conservation. I think that making life a priority of the fourth political theory, or making life itself an important part of a post-liberal vision, is important. But I also think that we shouldn't start saying that evolution is not true by our opposition to monotonic processes, because I think that evolution is not really a monotonic process as it's understood by science. I think that if a structure or an institution or something continually adapts in order to its changing circumstances, in order to maximize its admittedly limited lifespan, say the lifespan of a species, a line in the family tree of life on Earth, changes in circumstances in order to extend its lifespan as a species, not with that intention, but with that, with that result on an individual level of survival, or on a genetic level of survival, but that's not a monotonic process. That's simply an attempt to extend the lifespan as long as possible, which is a drive toward, I guess it's a drive toward eternity that we can never achieve, but we're driven toward it anyway because we gain benefit from trying to extend our lives as long as possible. Anyway, I think that the monotonic process is an interesting subject of study. I'm not quite as skeptical as he is, but I am skeptical in my own way of progress and growth as concepts, as opposed to equilibrium as a concept. So I'm going to read some more about that in the future. So it's time for me to move on. At the end of that section, he said he was talking about the philosophy of conservatism. And one last thing that I thought was interesting was when he talked about Apollo and Dionysus, the Greek gods, the Apollonian movement toward the Logos and the balance of the nocturnal Dionysian world. Nietzsche talks about those. He mentions Nietzsche there. We're going to get into that in a couple of books as well. That's coming down the pipeline. So there are a lot of things that are mentioned here that I'm interested in and I'm going to be talking about further. But I want to go into when he talks about the philosophy of conservatism. He lays out like 3 different types of conservatism that he talks about. I want to talk about those as well, in particular, one of them. So he talks about conservatism. He says, quote, "First, what is conservatism? It is a no said to that which is around one. In the name of what? In the name of something that came earlier. in the name of that which, properly speaking, was overcome at some point during socio-political history. That is, conservatism is the pursuit of an ontological, philosophical, socio-political, individual, natural, religious, cultural, and scientific position that repudiates the movements of things that we are at this time encountering and which we identified and described earlier. We are speaking now of conservatism, and that with which one can deny the very course of history, pushing away from the sort of socio-political topography that has driven us to modernity and post-modernity. This means the new age of modernity, with its linear vectors of progress and with its postmodern contortions, which are taking us away into the labyrinths of the disintegration of individual reality and to the rhizomatic subject or post-subject. But one can include here also earlier stages, which made this tendency possible and dominant. Conservatism builds its position on an opposition to the logic of the unfolding of the historical process, the phenomenology of modernity, as in our time of postmodernity, the rot of which conservatism seeks to reject, serves as an argument in this opposition. But conservatism as a structure does not lead to an impugning of phenomena. Negatively valued phenomenology here is not more than a pretext. Conservatism constructs a topography that rejects the logic, work, and direction of historical time. End quote. So, basically, that's a rather different vision of what conservatism is. It's an opposition to that which is around one. Now, many people would say that conservatism has to have some component of maintaining that which is around one. The scenario in which you are is there for a reason, it's valid, and it should be maintained. That's not the same as saying no to that which is around one and rejecting it in the name of something that came earlier. That is, to my understanding, reactionarism. The idea that we need to take down what's here and replace it with something from the past. I think that's a part of conservatism, but I don't know as though that's the full definition of it. But anyway, he talks about the three different types of conservatism, and first he talks about fundamental conservatism or traditionalism. And he says, quote, "The first approach is so-called traditionalism. Conservatism could well be traditionalism. In some models of political science, traditionalism and conservatism differ, as for instance in Mannheim's. But nevertheless, the aspiration to leave everything as it was in traditional societies, to preserve that way of life, is undoubtedly conservatism. A more logical traditionalism, substantial, philosophical, ontological, and conceptual, is one that criticizes, not various aspects of modernity and postmodernity, but that rejects the fundamental vector of historical development. That is, one that essentially opposes time. Traditionalism is that form of conservatism which contends the following. What is bad are not these separate fragments here and there within a larger system that call out for our repudiation. In the contemporary world, everything is bad. The idea of progress is bad. The idea of technological development is bad. Descartes' philosophy of the subject and object is bad. Newton's metaphor of the watchmaker is bad. Contemporary positive science and the education and pedagogy founded upon it are bad. This episteme, reasons the conservative traditionalist, is no good. It is a totalitarian, false, negative episteme against which one must fight. And further, if we think his thought through, I like only that which existed before the start of modernity. One could go further and subject those tendencies to criticism that in traditional society itself made possible the appearance of modernity all the way up to the idea of linear time. Such traditionalist conservatism, after the fall of monarchs, the separation of church and state, and the taking up of the baton of modernity by all socio-political, cultural, and historical nations, was thought to be non-existent. End quote. Okay, so that covers the fundamentalist or traditionalist conservative. Is very, very much opposed to all the things that are modern. Still, to some degree, bound I think, in some sort of concept of what came before better than what is here now in the sense of linear time. But it also, it harks to the sense that there are two types of existence, modern and traditional, and we are simply in the throes of a modern cycle, but that it's not going to last forever, and at some point we'll return to a traditionalist world. Anyway, so the next one that he talks about is the status quo conservative, or the liberal conservative. Now, I think, I'll just say in advance, I think that in many ways he's talking about the American conservative. And I think that it's maybe, he's a little harsh. He says, quote, "Liberal conservatives reason approximately thus. It is good that there is the free individual, but this free post-individual, that's a little too much. Or take the question of the end of history. Fukuyama at first believed that politics had disappeared and that it would eventually be entirely replaced by the global marketplace, in which nations, governments, ethnicities, cultures, and religions disappear. But later he decided that one would have to slow the process down and implement post-modernity more calmly, without revolutions, because in revolutions there could appear something undesirable, which could disrupt the plan of the end of history. And then Fukuyama started to write that it is necessary to temporarily strengthen national governments. This is already liberal conservatism. Liberal conservatives do not like leftists. They also do not like right-wingers, such as Evola and Guénon, either, but these they do not notice at all. But as soon as they see leftists, they immediately square up. Liberal conservatives are distinguished by the following qualitative structural characteristics: agreement with the general trends of modernity, but disagreement with its more avant-garde manifestations, which seem excessively dangerous and unhealthy. For instance, the English philosopher Edmund Burke at first sympathized with the Enlightenment, but after the French Revolution he pushed away from it and developed a liberal conservative theory with a front-end criticism of revolution and leftists. Hence the liberal conservative program: to defend freedom, rights, the independence of man, progress and equality, but by other means, through evolution, not revolution, lest there be, God forbid, a release from some basement of those dormant energies which the Jacobins issued in the Terror and then in the Anti-Terror, and so on. In this way, liberal conservatism principally does not protest against those tendencies which constitute the essence of modernity and even post-modernity, although liberal conservatives before the face of post-modernity will press down more strongly on the brake pedal than before. That is, here at some point they can even shout out, "Halt!" End quote. So, I think he doesn't really take the liberal conservative very seriously. Just kind of like, oh, go ahead with liberalism, just slow it down a little bit. I think that there's a certain truth to that, and yet I also think the following. The United States of America is founded upon many of the ideas that Dugin folds into liberalism, and that can be folded into liberalism by Patrick Deneen or even Yoram Hazony, I think, in some ways. So this is fundamental to the American temperament, and I think that to thoroughly try to remove it from American conservatism would be foolish and naive and difficult, and wouldn't go smoothly. I think that liberalism is part of the American spirit, and so the American is going to have to, I think, take up that mantle of the liberal conservative, that because we do value things like free markets and the dignity of the individual, right? The individual rights. Much of libertarianism is embodied in this liberal conservative perspective. I mean, that's essentially libertarianism by another name. So we'll keep that in mind as we discuss this further. I want to get to the third type of conservative that he describes, which is the conservative revolutionary. He says, quote, One can describe the general paradigm of the conservative revolutionary worldview in the following manner. There exists an objective process of degradation in the world. This is not simply the striving of evil forces to perpetrate their chicanery, it is the forces of freedom, the forces of the market, which lead humanity along the path of degeneration. The peak of degeneration, from the point of view of conservative revolutionaries, is modernity. So far, everything overlaps with the traditionalist position, but in contrast to it, conservative revolutionaries begin to ask themselves, why did it happen that belief in God who created the world, in divine providence, in the sacred, in myth, transforms in a specific moment into its own opposite? Why does it slacken, and why are the enemies of God victorious? A further suspicion arises. Maybe that remarkable golden age, which the fundamentalist conservatives defend, carried in itself some kind of gene of future perversion. Maybe things were not all that great even in religion. Maybe those religious, sacral, and sacred forms of traditional society, which we can still catch a glimpse of up until the onset of modernity, carried in themselves a certain element of decay. And then the conservative revolutionaries say to the conservative fundamentalists, you offer to return to a condition when man exhibited only the first symptoms of illness, when there first began the hacking cough. Today this man lies dying, but you speak of how good things were for him earlier. You contrast a coughing man with a dying one. But we want to dig down to discover from whence came the infection, and why he started to cough. The fact that in coughing he does not die but goes to work does not convince us that he is whole and healthy. Somewhere, that virus must have nested even earlier. We believe, continue the conservative revolutionaries, that in the very source, in the very deity, in the very first cause, there is drawn up the intention of organizing this eschatological drama. In such a vision, the modern acquires a paradoxical character. It is not merely today's sickness in the repudiated present. It is a disclosure in today's world of that which yesterday's world prepared for it, so precious for traditionalists. Modernity does not become better from this, and tradition, meanwhile, loses its unequivocal positivity. End quote. So the conservative revolutionary sounds kind of like an atheistic approach almost. It seems to question even the most fundamental concepts of fundamental conservatism, and even the very most ancient ideas of God, why belief in God leads to this. That seems like what they're saying, or what he is saying. He says, we believe that in the very source, in the very deity, in the very first cause, there is drawn up the intention of organizing this eschatological drama. In other words, this is all just the playing out of a plan. But it also later he says, conservative revolutionaries want not only to slow time down like the liberal conservatives or to return to the past like the traditionalists, but to pull out from the structure of the world the roots of evil, to abolish time as a destructive quality of reality, and in so doing fulfilling some kind of secret, parallel, non-evident intention of the deity itself. That sounds real strange. Pulling out the roots of evil from the structure of the world and abolishing time just seems like a return to a complete animal state. At any rate, I think there is some bits and pieces of value from much of the ideas of the conservative revolutionaries, and I don't know as though everyone that he lists within that group would follow along at quite that same line, but it's interesting, and I will be reading a few books by some members of the conservative revolution era, which was largely Germany in the interwar period. So much of this evolved into Nazism, although I think that he does state that some of them tried to help Jews escape or were participants in the anti-fascist underground. So I'm not sure that there's a really smooth overlap between this conservative revolutionary thought and like Nazism, but it is somewhat radical in its in the terminology that he uses to describe it. So now that we've got those three types of conservatism out of the way, he talks about how important conservatism is for fourth political theory. He begins to talk about something called Eurasianism, which is essentially the idea of the Eastern Europe and Russia and Northern Asia have a common culture and a common interest and common specific ways about them that should be embraced and advanced. At least that's kind of my understanding of it. I'll read a little bit about Eurasianism, and we can kind of see how we want to approach that. He says, quote, "Eurasianism is not a political philosophy, but an episteme. It concerns itself with the class of conservative ideologies and shares some characteristics with fundamental conservatism, traditionalism, and with the conservative revolution, including the social conservatism of the leftist Eurasianists. The one thing in conservatism that is not acceptable to Eurasianists is liberal conservatism. Eurasianism, recognizing the pretense of the Western logos to universality, refuses to recognize this universality as inevitability. This is the specific character of Eurasianism. It considers Western culture as a local and temporary phenomenon, and affirms a multiplicity of cultures and civilizations which coexist at different moments of a cycle. For Eurasianists, modernity is a phenomenon peculiar only to the West, while other cultures must divest these pretensions to the universality of Western civilization and build their societies on internal values. There is no single historical process. Every nation has its own historical model, which moves in a different rhythm and at different times in different directions. Eurasianism in itself is gnoseological plurality. The unitary episteme of modernity, including science, politics, culture, and anthropology, is opposed by the multiplicity of epistemes built on the foundations of each existing civilization. The Eurasianist episteme for Russian civilization, the Chinese for the Chinese, the Islamic for Islam, the Indian for the Indian, and so on. And only on these foundations, cleansed of Western mandated epistemes, must long-term socio-political, cultural, and economic projects be built." End quote. So that's Eurasianism as an episteme. So what's an episteme? Well, I believe it's basically a way of understanding the world, a knowledge system. And so the Eurasianist episteme is the way of understanding the world that is appropriate for Russian civilization. And there are different epistemes for different civilizations within here. Now, he says that the Eurasianist episteme is a conservative ideology. Well, he says it concerns itself with the class of conservative ideologies and shares some characteristics with fundamental conservatism and with the conservative revolution, but not liberal conservatism. So that's who is not allowed into the club. The liberal conservatives, which is largely the American conservatives, or particularly American fusionists, who take a sizable amount of libertarian theory into their knowledge base, into their episteme, if you will. Now, in a post-liberal world, as we see, as Patrick Deneen had described, the ultimate flawed nature of the liberal doctrine. And if we want to move out of ideologies and move out of the top-down approach, then we are going to move into a a post-liberal world in a way that is not necessarily, I mean, when he describes post-liberalism in here, he kind of describes it as the complete fulfillment of liberalism. But I think there's another sense of post-liberalism in which we are able to recognize the faults and the flaws of liberalism and build something new and transcend it. But we're going to carry on, in America, we're going to carry on many of the parts of liberalism, even after we see its flaws, and build something new and transcend liberalism and get rid of some of these notions that define our culture in a liberal direction. We're going to carry a few of those ideas from the Enlightenment with us. And so it's going to be a fourth political theory for America that is going to be primarily liberal conservative, and maybe room in it for the traditionalist conservative and room in it for the conservative revolutionary, but primarily would be built on liberal conservatism. Does that mean neoconservatism? No, I don't think it does. I think it means that we're going to adopt the fusionist base for American conservatism. The traditionalism and the libertarianism blended together. And maybe even adding in a bit of the conservative revolutionary thought. So that's not going to be expelled like that. And it's going to have to pick over the corpses of the second and third political theory. And I think that it's going to have to, take on a sort of a populist, from the wreckage of communism. I think that liberal conservatism, or post-liberal conservatism, is going to have to pick over the carcass of communism and kind of absorb what is of value within it, which I think to some degree is class consciousness and criticism of some of the excesses of capitalism and the idea of alienation, some of the criticisms it makes of liberalism. And I think that can come forward in a post-liberal conservatism in the form of populism, and in the form of the support of a robust middle class, the support of the working class and the working people of this country. That populist approach that's really all that we can get out of, because the economic theories, of Marxism aren't solid. But there's something of value there, and in fascism, obviously there's much to discard in fascism, but picking over its corpse, maybe there's a national pride and a national consciousness that can be extracted and absorbed into liberal, post-liberal conservatism. And I think that when you look at that and say, okay, you start with fusionism, which is traditionalism and libertarianism, and you fold in populism from the left, and you fold in nationalism from the right. Don't you just kind of wind up with paleoconservatism? I mean, isn't that what paleoconservatism is, in a way, is adopting the populism and adopting the nationalism that are the leftover remnants of the failed second and third political theories? I think so. So I think that the paleoconservatism is kind of like the post-liberal conservative, moving into other theories of thought to acquire, and in that way becomes kind of eclectic. And that comes back to what I was saying about the four hypotheses for what is going to be the subject of the fourth political theory. and how I had said that the first hypothesis is the one that I wanted to talk about, where it's a compound of the individual, the class, the state, the race, the nation. It's a compound ideology that extracts value from these various subjects, the class as a subject, the nation as a subject, but doesn't take one of them and place it on a pedestal and turn it into an ideology, but just is conscious of it as it proceeds. I think that's the correct approach. It's kind of an eclectic approach. It's a pragmatic approach. I've talked about eclecticism and I've talked about pragmatism, and I think that all these kinds of, it sounds kind of silly, but all these different isms, they all mean something, and they interact with each other, and to be eclectic is to recognize that there's something of value in all sorts of different writers and thinkers and belief systems, etc., that maybe isn't possible to immediately fuse it all together into a cohesive system right off the bat, but if you kind of recognize intuitively and observationally, hey, this works, this seems to have validity, that's good enough, because what matters is whether or not the accumulation of detritus of ideas is functional, and what the results are. So I think that's the path for the post-liberal fourth political theory American version, because Dugin's version is very anti-liberal. I mean, it's kind of rooted in destroying liberalism, and he places America as like the center of liberalism, and so therefore he's kind of on this destroy America kick. Obviously, I'm an American, and I'm making this show for Americans, and so we've got a different perspective on this, obviously. We move into a post-liberal world. We don't thoroughly reject every component of the Enlightenment and every component of liberalism. As Dugin said, we move past it. We accept that we can't turn around and go back. We don't pretend it didn't happen, and we find the parts of it that we like. Like I said, that we appreciate having a value of the individual, and we appreciate the fact that democracy has been put into the forefront of our political system. So anyway, that's about all I'm going to talk about there. The last section that I want to read is about the multipolar ideal. And this kind of comes back to how, Russia is going to take the Eurasian approach, and they've got their versions of conservatism that they want to advance, and we've got maybe a different version of conservatism that we want to form the core of our post-liberal ideology, or our post-liberal political theory, I should say. So he talks about the multipolar ideal. He says, quote, "The idea of a multipolar world, where the poles will be as many as there are civilizations, allows one to propose to humanity a broad choice of cultural, paradigmatic, social, and spiritual alternatives. We shall have a model with the availability of regional universalism in concrete large spaces, which will give to enormous zones and significant segments of humanity an unavoidable social dynamic, characteristic of globalization and openness, but without those shortcomings that globalization has taken on a global scale. Moreover, in such a system, regionalism and the autonomous and independent development of local, ethnic, and religious communities can be developed at full speed, inasmuch as the more unifying pressure characteristic of national governments weakens considerably. We see this in the European Union, where integration considerably facilitates the development of local communes and so-called Euro regions. In addition, we shall be able at last to decide the fundamental contradiction between exclusivism and inclusivism of the imperial identity. The planet will present itself not as one sole occupine with the inherent cultural racism of this solitariness in the distribution of the title of civilized nations as opposed to barbarians and savages, but as a few occupines, a few heavens, where there will live side by side in their rhythm, in their context, in their own time, with their own consciousness and unconsciousness, not one humanity, but a few. It is impossible to say beforehand how relations between them will turn out. Surely, both dialogue and collisions will emerge, but something else is more important. History will continue, and we will return from that fundamental historical dead end to which uncritical faith in progress, rationality, and the gradual development of humanity drove us. Something in man changes with time, but something remains eternal and invariable. Civilization allows one to strictly develop everything in its place. Reason and the philosophical, social, political, and economic systems created by it will be able to develop according to their own lines, while the collective unconscious will freely preserve its archetypes, its basis, and inviolability. Moreover, in every civilization, both rationality and the unconscious can affirm their own standards, secure their correctness, and strengthen them or change them according to its own discretion. There will be no universal standard, neither in the material nor in the spiritual aspect. Each civilization will at last receive the right to freely proclaim that which is, according to its wishes, the measure of things. Somewhere that will be man, somewhere religion, somewhere ethics, somewhere materialism. But in order that the project of multipolarity can realize itself, we must still survive a few more skirmishes. And in the first place, it is necessary to get the better of the first and foremost enemy, globalization, the striving of the Atlantic Western Pole to hang its unipolar hegemony on all the nations and countries on Earth, despite the deep and sure observations of its own best intellectuals. Many representatives of the political establishment of the USA continue as before to use the term civilization in a singular sense, understanding by it American civilization. This is the real challenge to which all nations of the earth, and Russians most of all, must give an adequate response. End quote. So there he's talking about this multipolar ideal of a world of civilizations that largely keep to themselves. He calls it not one humanity, but a few. So that each has its own, he says they live side by side in their own rhythm, in their context, in their own time, with their own consciousness and unconsciousness. And so, obviously, there's going to be interactions between civilizations. It's not like completely cut off, but he kind of proposes this sort of isolation and multipolar status of the world so that there's not any sort of drive toward one global government or one global regime. Now, being an American and being concerned with the interests of America, on the one hand, I see us losing our share of global power in such a scenario, and so I say, well, that's I should be skeptical. But on the other hand, I have to think of the viability of a global empire and whether or not that's really what our intentions are, and whether or not such a thing is really viable, whether it's an empire in name or what. I think that following along the same best practices approach of plurality that I've been talking about in this podcast so far, that having the idea of multipolar, civilizationally constructed world makes sense. Now, how is that compared to the nationally constructed nationalist vision versus the civilizationalist vision? The nationalist vision kind of makes for a greater plurality, more nations trying more different things and more nuance in culture. But I also kind of think that maybe the smaller nation states are going to have borders that might be more commonly in flux. And then is that going to be good, or is a more civilizational approach with borders that are less in flux maybe is the better approach? I don't really know, but it's certainly interesting to think about. But for now, the concern is, the long-term stability and viability of the United States. I think a multipolar world makes some degree of sense, so we can kind of begin to mind our own business, which I think is a necessary step for us. So anyway, that's all I'm going to read from this book. There are other sections. He gets into some pretty heavy philosophy. He talks about time and Heidegger more and phenomenology and whatnot. I'm going to leave that for you guys to read on your own. I highly recommend you pick this book up. You can't get it from Amazon because they banned it, but you can get it at the time of this recording. You can get it from barnesandnoble.com. So I'll post a link to that. And I guess that's all for now. Check me out on social media. Mostly Facebook and Twitter are where I'm active. You can just search for Neofusionist. It's not hard to find. And if you want to support the show, you can become a patron and help me get the books and supplies and marketing that the show needs. So that'll be all for now. Thanks for tuning in, and I'll catch you on the flip side. Bye.